The battleship New Jersey pounds Drew's positions in the mountains outside Beirut. Good evening, Geoff Raymond in Melbourne with ABC News. And the civil war in Lebanon is still commanding world attention tonight. As the withdrawal of the multinational peacekeeping forces from Beirut continues, American naval units have unleashed one of the biggest bombardments since the Vietnam War. The battleship New Jersey used the full force of its 40-centimeter guns on Muslim positions in the hills around Beirut. As the fighting escalates in Beirut, there have been reports today of small arms fire exchanges between the warring factions and the 1,200-man United States Marine contingent. No American casualties have been reported. However, the former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, speaking in Melbourne today, criticized the involvement of the peacekeeping force.
Visible presence at all.
The Northern Territory's Chief Minister, Mr. Paul Everingham, is to quit local politics and seek pre-selection for the Territory's lone seat in the House of Representatives. Mr. Everingham said this morning that the decision was definite. Subject to pre-selection by his country Liberal Party colleagues, he'd resign as Chief Minister a few weeks before the next federal elections. Mr. Everingham said he believed the Prime Minister would call an early poll this year and he'd go to Canberra to fight for the Territory's interests. He spoke to reporter Rod McLean.
Giving away the...
Australian officials travelling with the Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke, made representations today for 5 South Korean dissidents in the South Korean capital, Seoul. Barry Cassidy reports that Mr. Hawke asked for and got approval from President Chun for the Australian officials to meet South Korean officials on the issue of human rights. The National Farmers Federation has come out in support of Mr. Hawke's suggestion, announced last week in Japan, to cut tariffs in an attempt to bolster the competitiveness of Australian exports. In Canberra today, the Federation said Australia had to become more internationally competitive in agriculture.
Speaking at the launch of a national committee in Canberra, this is Ron Miller.
And a senior Dutch cabinet minister currently visiting Australia has also welcomed Mr. Hawke's plans to restructure Australian industry and reduce protection. Dr. Frits Bolkestein, the Netherlands Minister for Foreign Trade, says an open trading policy can only lead to more competition and improved products.
Dr. Bolkestein is leading a 25-man trade.
U.S. space officials have located the missing West Star satellite launched at the weekend by the Space Shuttle Challenger. It's been found in the wrong orbit, apparently caused when a booster rocket exploded on launch, but scientists say it may be able to be used for a few hours a day as it passes over ground stations. Another space exercise went wrong for the Challenger crew when a balloon to be used for space recovery techniques blew up after launch.
The Challenger crew...
France has sent 12 helicopter gunships to Chad to strengthen air support for its troops in the North African country. They join a number of other French military aircraft flown in over the past week, following the French decision to move its defense line a further 80 kilometers north. The new line, held by about 3,000 French troops, separates the territory held by government forces from the Philippines. Followers of the assassinated opposition leader, Mr. Benigno Aquino, have completed a 120-kilometer protest run to Manila Airport, where he was shot dead last August. The protest was one of 2 big anti-government demonstrations in Manila on the same day. The Builders Labourers Federation wants the state government to license and register asbestos removers and has called for tougher guidelines on the removal of asbestos.
The Builders Labourers Federation said...
The state government has warned the Commonwealth that it faces difficulties with the proposed introduction of its resource rent tax this year. The Minister for Minerals and Energy, Mr. White, says Victoria has not yet been given enough information about the tax.
The resource rent tax to see. The 2 states in the state committing itself to the new resource rent tax.
A parliamentary committee investigating Victoria's irrigation system has been told the system is uneconomic and should be scaled down. As well, the Parliamentary Public Bodies Review Committee has been told farmers should pay more for their irrigation water.
The report by Monash farmers in the Murray-Goulburn Irrigation District could afford to pay up to $30 a megalitre.
Well, I'll be back in a few moments, but now with today's sporting news, here's Clark Hansen.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Well, Tasmania has defeated New South Wales by 50 runs in the Sheffield Shield match in Sydney. In tonight's sport, now back to you, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Clark. An international conference in Melbourne has attracted meteorologists and atmospheric scientists from around the world. Apparently, the city's notoriously fickle weather is being regarded as somewhat of a bonus.
Melbourne, the city of contrasting weather conditions. A day at the beach to calm the heatwave can end in a gritty, stormy affair. Melbourne can also send one running for the Woolies at the most unlikely times of the year. And of course, what would spring be without wind? Hold on to your hats. and the squelching of gumboots. There is good reason why Melbourne's weather is so unpredictable. The experts call it mesoscale. Today, more than 170 meteorological experts from throughout the world gathered to discuss the characteristics of this amazing phenomenon.
We like to look at things such as...
For complaint. But when next you criticise the Weather Bureau for giving the incorrect forecast, be patient. It's mesoscale at work. Mark Bailey, ABC News.
Now, finally, the main news again. President Gemayel of Lebanon is struggling to retain power as warring factions in the country battle on the streets of Beirut. The Prime Minister takes up the issue of human rights in South Korea. An American space official looking for a missing satellite launched from the shuttle at the weekend. And I'll be back with the late news at about 5 to 10. But now, with a look ahead to this year's first nationwide, here's Peter Couchman.
Thank you, Geoff.
The loyalty of the Army.
Police have blocked off roads around the Petroleum Refinery Authority in Cororoit Creek Road in Altona following the collapse of a floating roof on a petrol tank. Firemen say the situation is dangerous because the roof is used to prevent the escape of fumes which could cause an explosion if ignited. 7 fire units and 25 firemen are at the scene and are now laying a foam blanket on the 3,800 kilolitre tank. Petrol is also being pumped from the tank, and police and fire services are expected to remain at the scene for at least another 4 hours. Investigators in Argentina have reportedly found a mass grave where they believe about 700 people were buried after being tortured and shot by officials of the military dictatorship. If the report is proved, it'd be the largest mass grave discovered in Argentina. One official said exhumation of the grave at Cordoba's San Vicente Cemetery would begin in a few days. Cordoba, Argentina's second largest city, was said to be one of the most ferocious centers of repression during military rule. The official told reporters the federal court had been given a ledger from the Cordoba city morgue listing approximately 700 people whose bodies passed through the morgue in the years following the 1976 military coup. He said the book detailed the tortures and torments and bullet holes from firing squads on the bodies received in the morgue. Human rights organizations in Argentina blame security forces for the abduction, torture and murder of as many as 15,000 suspected leftists in the years following the coup. Australian officials travelling with the Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke, made representations today for 5 South Korean dissidents in the South Korean capital, Seoul. Barry Cassidy reports that Mr. Hawke asked for and got approval from President Chun for the Australian officials to meet South Korean officials on the issue of human rights.
Regional security is the big issue.
Movement. It's also drawn up a list of asbestos removers who comply with the union safety standards.
A former Melbourne fireman was committed for trial today on a charge of setting fire to a house at Cockatoo in 1981. Leo John Pretty, 33, of Selby, was ordered to stand trial in the Supreme Court, charged with arson on a house in 2nd Avenue, Cockatoo, on the 9th of February 1981. 4 other charges relating to fires at Cockatoo on Ash Wednesday last year were adjourned until later this week. A parliamentary committee investigating Victoria's irrigation system has been told the system is uneconomic and should be scaled down. As well, the Parliamentary Public Bodies Review Committee has been told farmers should pay more for their irrigation water.
The report by Monash University to pay up to $30 a megalitre.
4 West Australian policemen and a police aide have been charged with manslaughter after a coroner's inquiry into the death of a 16-year-old Aboriginal youth at Roban in Western Australia's Pilbara region. John Patt was found dead in a police cell last September.
The coronial inquiry into the...
A company commander in Vietnam who complained about his men being sprayed with herbicides was told it wouldn't harm dumb animals. This was revealed in evidence today before the Agent Orange Royal Commission in Sydney.
Colonel Claude Ducker, MC, was sea company's questions were ludicrous. Would positions be reported by radio, Mr. O'Keefe asked. Well, we didn't have carrier pigeons, Colonel Ducker retorted.
Well, now we'll take a brief look at tomorrow's weather forecast. And a milder southwesterly airstream will develop over the state tomorrow in the wake of the cold front, which has now reached the west of the state. So, Victoria can expect a mild to warm day with rain and thunderstorms contracting to the northeast, south to southwest winds, moderate to rough seas abating. And for Melbourne, mild with a few showers, moderate south to southwest winds, a temperature range from 14 to 23 degrees. And that's the news to now. Of course, there'll be more on ABC Radio tomorrow morning and the next major television news at 7 tomorrow night. For now, from me, good night. Commitment to Lebanon was unwavering. He blamed Syria for the fighting and called on Damascus to help stop the bloodshed. In Jerusalem, Israeli officials and Western diplomats said Israel was unlikely to go to the aid of President Gemayel. The Israelis said they would undertake limited action, such as airstrikes or bombardment of Shiite Muslim or Druze positions, only in coordination with the United States. We'll have more foreign news later, but first, the Painters and Dockers Royal Commissioner says the proposed National Crimes Authority won't work. The trial of Father Brian Gore is postponed when hundreds of people crush into the court where the trial was to be held, and the space shuttle loses another satellite. The Royal Commissioner investigating the Ship's Painters and Dockers Union, Mr. Frank Costigan, QC, today criticised the proposed National Crimes Authority, saying it would have no effect on organised crime in Australia. Mr. Costigan said the authority could be stopped dead because of weaknesses in its constitution.
The Royal Commissioner told us Senator Martin Curtis, Melbourne.
Archaeologists say Victoria's Aboriginal artefacts are now unprotected by the law following a decision by a Melbourne magistrate today. The magistrate, Mr. Maurice Gherkins, dismissed charges against a South Australian collector and a St Kilda auction company for planning to auction Aboriginal artefacts and criticised the legislation under which they were charged.
These are some of the 92...
The Federal Attorney General, Senator Gareth Evans, said today the present system of enforcing the payment of maintenance in Australia was in a total mess. Releasing the report of the National Maintenance Inquiry in Canberra, Senator Evans said up to 60% of people didn't comply with maintenance orders made against them because under the present enforcement system there was very little pressure on them to do so.
Evans said the inquiry had shown that only Canberra.
A senior officer of the Department of Foreign Affairs appeared briefly in a Canberra court today on charges relating to the unauthorised possession of departmental files. The details from Geoff Powell in Canberra.
Mr. Don Witherford was...
In other world news tonight, the trial of Father Brian Gore postponed, the space shuttle loses another satellite, and a slump on Wall Street. In the Philippines, a crowd of hundreds of people today forced a postponement in the trial of Australian priest Father Gore. The crowd jammed into the courtroom in Balangkalan, and the judge, defense lawyers, and prosecutors agreed that a new venue was needed. Father Gore, who is on trial for complicity in murder, earlier said he'd been threatened with death.
Father Gore and the two other priests...
The Space Shuttle Challenger's run of bad luck continued today when a second satellite launch failed. Like its predecessor, this satellite has ended up in the wrong orbit.
It had seemed that at ABC News, New York.
The chairman of the PLO, Mr. Yasser Arafat, has had talks with Iraq's President Hussein in Baghdad. Several hundred of Mr. Arafat's PLO fighters are still in Iraq after their evacuation last year from the northern Lebanese port of Tripoli. Mr. Arafat condemned Syria and Libya for their involvement in the Middle East conflict and praised President Hussein for his understanding of the Palestinian cause. President Hussein told Mr. Arafat he supported the PLO's determination to strengthen its independence. The USS Independence has dropped anchor in Istanbul in the first visit to Turkey by U.S. aircraft carriers since anti-U.S. riots there 15 years ago. The Independence will remain in harbor until the end of the week. Scientists believe the Mount St. Helens volcano is about to have a major eruption. They say the level of seismic activity around the volcano is rising daily. When the last volcano erupted in 1980, it killed 57 people. Security at Indian diplomatic missions around the world has been stepped up after the assassination of an Indian consul worker in Birmingham. An organization known as the Kashmir Liberation Army claimed responsibility for the killing. Sri Lankan leaders called for national unity as the island celebrated its 36th anniversary of independence. Thousands of people took part in the festivities. Share prices dropped to their lowest level in more than a year on the New York Stock Exchange today, ending the market's prolonged bullish run. Martin Gillam filed this report.
Brokers said there was an element of panic in today's selling.
Poor performance of overseas share markets resulted in gold and mining stocks falling on Australian markets today. The major indices fell between 10 and 20 points, with All Ordinaries Index closing at 762, a drop of 16 points. There was more bad economic news with the announcement by the Westpac Bank that it had increased its indicator lending rate to 12.5%. It's the first rise in interest rates since last June.
Westpac's move to raise interest...
Now, still to come in this bulletin, final testing of the first turbine in Loy Yang Power Station. David Hooks passed fit for the Caribbean tour, but Graham Yallop still doubtful. And a Kentucky man demonstrates the art of spelling back to front. The first turbine of the gigantic Loy Yang Power Station is undergoing final testing and should be online by May. The first turbine of the gigantic Loy Yang Power Station is undergoing final testing and should be online by May. The SEC says introduction of the 500 megawatt unit will significantly reduce the chance of power restrictions this winter.
The first steam was released into the massive 500 about 1990. Construction of the power station, which has faced long delays through industrial disruption, started 7 years ago.
The Pharmaceutical Society of Australia has called on the federal government to ban smoking on all domestic aircraft in Australia. The president of the society, Mr. Nelson Hunt Sharp, said the current arrangements of smoking and non-smoking sections were unsatisfactory because smoke from smoking sections spread throughout the plane, causing discomfort, inconvenience and health risks to many passengers. I'll be back in a few moments, but now with today's sporting news, here's Clark Hansen.
Thank you very much, Geoff. And at 2
ABC News.
Top American golfer Craig Staley.
Well, every week.
And that's all in tonight's sport. Now, back to you, Geoff.
Thank you very much, Clark. Well, spelling can be a difficult skill for many young students and a fair proportion of us adults. But in Kentucky, one man has made it his hobby to know the most awkward of words from back to front, literally.
Is it from?
Well, finally, the latest reports from war-torn Beirut. Unconfirmed reports say that Muslim militiamen have driven the Lebanese army from most of its positions in the western part of the city during a night of heavy fighting. The battle grew louder as day broke. Reuters quotes a military source as saying that whole units of the army had defected, most of them to the Amal Shiite Muslim militia. He said elements of the army were making a last stand in some places. Well, that's the news to now. I'll be back with a late bulletin about 10 to 10. For now, with a look ahead to nationwide, here's Peter Couchman.
Thank you, Geoff.
To become the first human satellites.
Astronaut Bruce McCandless, ABC News, New York.
And while NASA celebrates the shuttle mission's first success, the insurance world in London is reeling because of Challenger's earlier failures. The shuttle lost 2 satellites, which were insured for almost $200 million. Russ Morgan reports that Lloyd's may even consider suing NASA if they can prove negligence.
With both satellites.
Now, the news from home, including tonight a coroner handing down his findings on the Ash Wednesday fires at Cockatoo. The Victorian opposition leader predicts the government will win control of the upper house at the next elections, and highlights of the first of the World Series cricket finals. The Melbourne coroner says the Ash Wednesday bushfires in the
ABC News.
The state opposition leader, Mr. Kennett, believes the Cairn Labor government will win control of the upper house at the next election. Because of this, he says the government should be voted out of office in the lower house.
Mr. Kennett called a news conference today as the best possible job.
The Australian Conservation Foundation says mining in the Antarctic would have a disastrous effect on the environment. The Foundation's director, Dr. Geoff Mosley, told the Senate Standing Committee on National Resources that mining would threaten bird and marine life and pollute the Antarctic region.
The Antarctic News.
The Prime Minister has finished 3 hours of talks with China's Premier Zhao, during which he strongly urged the Chinese not to resume nuclear testing. As Barry Cassidy reports, much of the discussion between the two leaders centered on arms control and disarmament.
The start of ABC News.
The Secretary of the Victoria Police Association, Chief Inspector Tom Rippon, says the state government must provide more money for public transport or face up to a drop in the number of crimes being solved. And senior officers of the drug squad say some investigations are being held up by 6 months to a year because of a lack of cars.
The drug squad officers say operation
policies have not created a major recovery in the economy. He says last year's improvement in the labour market has obviously ended, and Mr. Willis is wrong in saying there hasn't been a change in the trend.
Our cost structure continues to rise, and the policies of this government, both in respect of wage increases and the budget deficit, can only worsen our inflation and our unemployment.
The former Chief Stipendiary Magistrate in New South Wales, Mr. Murray Farquhar, is to stand trial on charges of perverting the course of justice. The charges stem from a 1977 court case involving fraud charges against the then rugby league boss, Mr. Kevin Humphreys.
Mr. Farquhar has been in and out of court many times in the last...
After the French government intervened. Share prices in New York have plummeted again, with sellers pushing prices to their lowest levels in almost a year. Jim Middleton reports from New York that big government deficits and high U.S. interest rates are behind the plunge.
The big sell-off started. ABC News, New York.
And Australian share markets are also continuing their downward trend. But today's falls were not as severe as in the last 2 days, and brokers say there was a distinct rally in the afternoon. By the close of business, the All Ordinaries Index stood at 747. That's only 1.5 points down on yesterday. China will consider buying big quantities of pig iron from Australia for processing into steel. The Chinese Premier, Mr. Zhao, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke, agreed in Peking today to investigate the idea.
A stroll through Peking's temples of heaven.
Now, still to come in this bulletin, the first all-Aboriginal branch of the ALP, proposals to replace Kooyong as the venue for the Australian Open, and glass found in some jams on Coles supermarket shelves. The first all-Aboriginal branch of any major Australian political party will be established tonight. The Federal Aboriginal Affairs Minister, Mr. Holding, will open the first meeting of the Murray-Goulburn Branch Labor Party at Mooroopna.
The branch has been formed by...
The National Party says it will try to defeat the Kane government by contesting marginal city seats at the next state election.
State leader Mr. Peter Ross Edwards told...
Coles' New World supermarket chain is recalling thousands of jars of house-brand jam from stores throughout Australia after reports that they contain glass splinters. Dominic Schwartz reports. I'll be back in a few moments, but now with today's sporting news, here's Clark Hansen.
Thank you very much, Geoff. And the Lawn Tennis Association...
Supporters of the massive green maze will object to the possibility of it becoming redundant. However, one thing is blatantly clear. If Australia is to compete with the rest of the world, initially it must provide first-class facilities. Mark Bailey, ABC News.
Defending champion Bob Shearer leads the field after the... And that's all in tonight's sport. Now back to you, Geoff.
Thanks very much, Clark. Now, reviewing the main news, the battleship New Jersey pounds Drew's positions in the hills around Lebanon. The state opposition says there should have been an independent inquiry into the events of Ash Wednesday. BP to close its Westernport refinery at a cost of 200 jobs. And former New South Wales magistrate Murray Farquhar to face trial on charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice. That's the news to now. I'll be back with the late bulletin about 25 minutes to 10. Now, with a look ahead to Nationwide, here's Peter Couchman.
Thank you, Geoff. Well, the people of Beirut have learned the difference between a withdrawal and a redeployment.
Hills around Beirut for the second day. Good evening, Geoff Raymond in Melbourne with the ABC National News. Now, in tonight's bulletin, speculation that Soviet President Yuri Andropov might be dead. State governments consider revised tax arrangements. BHP cautious about a plan to export iron ore to China. And more trouble for the space shuttle. Now, the details. An American destroyer has again shelled anti-government rebel positions in the Syrian-held mountains east of Beirut. And there are reports that shelling by the battleship New Jersey has killed a senior Syrian military officer. U.S. officials, meanwhile, say they can't confirm reports that Syria's commanding general in Lebanon and several of his staff were killed during the 10-hour pounding of their mountain positions by American ships yesterday. American fighter bombers flew over Syrian positions today in what has been described as a show of force. In Damascus, the Druze leader, Walid Jumblat, warned that U.S. establishments in Beirut would be attacked if the naval bombardments continued. And in Beirut itself, sporadic fighting is still being reported along the so-called Green Line, dividing Muslim West Beirut from the Christian east of the city.
As is constant.
And in the speculation that the Soviet President, Yuri Andropov, has died. Regular television and radio programs in Moscow have been uncharacteristically changed to classical broadcasts. To date, the United States Embassy has had no official confirmation that any member of the Soviet leadership has died. Mr. Andropov has been ill for some time and has failed to keep appointments at the Kremlin. We'll be monitoring the situation and bring you further developments as they come to hand. State governments are considering a draft report dealing with a revised distribution of taxation powers. The report now being circulated amongst the states is the product of a committee established at last year's Premier's Conference.
The redistribution of money...
BHP has reacted cautiously to a Sino-Australian agreement for a study of the possibility of large export contracts for steel products. The head of BHP's steel division, Mr. David Rice, says the company doesn't have much information yet about what the study might cover.
A period of time to enable you to start up a plan.
The Agent Orange Royal Commission in Sydney today completed the first part of its public hearings, those dealing solely with the question of exposure to chemicals in Vietnam. Council's addresses on the subject will be heard next Wednesday. Prakash Merchandani sums up the evidence so far.
Over the 10 years of Army records are now being examined to verify the incident.
Now to world news, including tonight a bad avalanche in Switzerland, 2 Basque separatists gunned down in France, and more trouble for the space shuttle. Well, much of Western Europe has been hit by a series of late winter blizzards and fierce storms. The worst affected areas are in the alpine ranges of France, Austria and Switzerland, where avalanches have also been a problem. Rescue workers are still searching the snow at several Swiss ski resorts for people who may be still buried. The blizzards and avalanches have killed at least 32 people in the past few days, and a number of villages in the Alps have been evacuated. The bad weather has also brought floods to several European countries, including Holland, Austria and France. The flooding was widespread in southern Holland, but so far no serious injuries have been reported.
24 Victorian Open Golf Championship each night as our last programme, and live on Saturday and Sunday commencing at 1 o'clock.
Our children's entertainment continues in just a...
Returning 7:30 Saturday, Four Corners. Investigative reporting at its best. Hard-hitting, controversial.